The morning Marlene Radcliffe showed up at my door with a clipboard and a self-righteous smile so wide it practically needed its own zip code. I knew exactly what kind of day it was going to be. It was 7:30 in the morning. The temperature outside was sitting at a brutally unfriendly 12 degrees Fahrenheit, and there was already 4 inches of fresh snow on the ground from the storm that had rolled through overnight. My driveway looked like a fluffy white crime scene. My truck was buried under a small glacier, and I hadn't even had my first cup of coffee yet. And there she was, Marlene Radcliffe, HOA board president, self-appointed neighborhood inspector, and the kind of person who could find a violation in a sunrise if she looked hard enough. She was standing on my front porch in her big puffy coat with the fur-lined hood, looking up at my chimney like it had personally offended her ancestors. I opened the door still in my flannel robe, coffee mug in hand, squinting at her like she was a hallucination. "Good morning, Jason," she said, in that voice she used that somehow managed to be both pleasant and deeply threatening at the same time, like a cat purring while showing you its claws. "Marlene," I said, "it's 7:30. HOA business doesn't keep bankers' hours," she said, clicking her pen and scribbling something on her clipboard. "I'm here to issue you a formal warning. Your chimney smoke is a nuisance to the neighborhood. It's been billowing constantly since yesterday evening. It smells like burning wood, and several of your neighbors have lodged complaints." I stared at her. Then I looked up at my chimney. A thin, lazy curl of white smoke drifted into the gray winter sky, barely visible. "That's my wood stove, Marlene," I said. "I know what it is," she said. "It's an eyesore and a health hazard, and our HOA bylaws have very specific language about noxious emissions from residential properties." "It's a wood stove," I repeated. "It's 12 degrees outside. I'm heating my house." "You have a gas furnace," she said, tapping her clipboard like she'd done her research, which somehow made it more annoying. "There's no need for you to be burning wood and polluting the shared air of this community." I took a long, slow sip of my coffee and just looked at her for a moment. Because here's the thing about Marlene Radcliffe that she didn't know I knew. Our houses weren't just neighbors. They were semi-detached townhomes, built in the 1980s back, when the developer thought it would be clever to share a common wall between units to save on materials. My townhouse and Marlene's townhouse shared one wall. One long brick-and-mortar wall that ran from the front of the house all the way to the back. And my wood stove sat right up against that shared wall. The beautiful, cast-iron Hearthstone Vermont model that I'd installed 3 winters ago after a February ice storm knocked out the power for 5 days, and my gas furnace decided it also needed electricity to run the igniter. I'd learned that lesson the hard way, shivering under 4 blankets, and I wasn't going through that again. But here's the really interesting part. That wood stove, sitting right up against the shared brick wall, radiated so much heat that it didn't just warm my side of the house. The thermal mass of that brick wall absorbed the heat and conducted it straight into Marlene's living room. I'd noticed it the first winter I ran the stove. My gas bill dropped by almost 40%. And a week after I started running the stove full-time that first season, Marlene had actually knocked on my door, back before she became my sworn HOA nemesis, and commented that her heating bills had mysteriously gone down that winter. She didn't know why. I didn't explain it. I just smiled and nodded. So here she was, 3 winters later, standing on my porch at 7:30 in the morning in 12-degree weather, threatening me with an HOA violation for the thing that was quietly and efficiently helping heat her own living room whether she liked it or not. The irony was so thick you could have spread it on toast. "I'll look at the bylaws," I told her pleasantly, and closed the door. I heard her make a noise somewhere between a gasp and a squawk on the other side of the door, but I was already walking back to the kitchen to top off my coffee. Now, I want to be clear that I'm not a confrontational person by nature. I'm a 42-year-old guy who works remotely doing IT infrastructure consulting. I like my wood stove. I like my dog Biscuit. I like my Saturday morning pancakes. And I generally prefer a quiet life. I've been in Pinecrest Commons for 6 years, and for the first 3 of those years, the HOA was a perfectly functional, reasonably run little organization that sent out reminders about gutters and organized the 4th of July block party. Then Marlene Radcliffe ran for HOA board president 2.5 years ago, and things took a sharp left turn into the kind of suburban nightmare you see in viral videos. She'd started small. Warnings about garbage can placement. Notices about holiday lights staying up past January 15th. A heated argument with old Phil Kowalski on the corner about his collection of garden gnomes, which Marlene insisted violated the no statuary over 18 inches rule, despite Phil's gnomes being famously, provably 16 inches tall. She'd escalated a dispute about a basketball hoop with the Nguyen family down the street into a 3-month-long legal standoff that cost them both money and eventually resolved in the Nguyens' favor when they pulled out the original covenant documents and showed that portable basketball hoops in driveways were explicitly permitted. The pattern was always the same. Marlene would identify something she didn't like, dress it up in HOA language, come at you with her clipboard and her smug little smile, and then use the HOA's fine structure and threat of legal action to grind people down until they either complied or gave up. She'd been particularly successful with newer residents who didn't know the bylaws well and were scared of rocking the boat. I knew the bylaws. I'd read them cover to cover the day after she went after Phil's gnomes. I kept a copy in my home office. I also kept records of every interaction I'd had with the HOA going back 2 years. Every letter, every email, every door knock. And I had a doorbell camera, 2 side cameras, and a backyard camera, all of which auto-uploaded to cloud storage with timestamps. Because in the age of Marlene Radcliffe, documentation was not optional. It was survival. I poured a second cup of coffee, fed biscuit, and pulled up the HOA bylaws on my laptop. I went straight to the section on emissions, which I'd actually read before because I'd anticipated this conversation might happen someday. The relevant language read as follows, and I'm paraphrasing here. No resident shall produce emissions from their property that constitute a demonstrable and documented health or safety nuisance to adjacent neighbors, as defined by applicable county and state environmental regulations. There it was. 2 very important qualifiers, demonstrable, and as defined by county and state environmental regulations. Not as defined by Marlene Radcliffe's personal opinion on the aesthetic qualities of chimney smoke. I pulled up the county environmental code. Wood-burning appliances were explicitly permitted. There were specific regulations about opacity of smoke, which basically meant you couldn't be running a black smoke machine, but a properly maintained, well-seasoned hardwood fire produced white or gray smoke that was well within legal limits. I burned seasoned oak and cherry that I'd split and stacked myself the previous spring. My stove was EPA certified. I had the paperwork. Of course I had the paperwork. Because Marlene Radcliffe had trained me, through years of low-grade neighborhood warfare, to have the paperwork for everything. The formal warning letter arrived in my mailbox 3 days later, on a Tuesday, when the temperature had dropped even further to single digits, and there was another 6 inches of snow on the ground from a second storm that had blown through on Sunday night. The letter informed me that I was in violation of HOA Community Standards Section 7, subsection C, regarding noxious emissions, that I had 30 days to cease the offending activity, and that failure to comply would result in a fine of $200 per day, compounding. It was signed by Marlene Radcliffe, President, Pinecrest Commons Homeowners Association. I photographed the letter, filed it, and drafted a response. My response was polite, precise, and exactly 8 paragraphs long. I cited the HOA bylaw in full, with the specific language about county and state environmental regulations. I cited the county code. I cited the EPA certification of my wood stove. I noted that my chimney had been inspected and certified clean by a licensed chimney sweep in October, and I attached a copy of that inspection certificate. I noted that my wood fuel was properly seasoned hardwood meeting all applicable standards. I noted that the smoke from my chimney was well within the legal opacity limits, and that no documented health complaints had been filed with any county or state environmental authority. I requested, politely but clearly, that the HOA provide specific documentation of any actual regulatory violation before proceeding further, and I sent it via certified mail, return receipt requested, with copies to the full HOA board, which consisted of Marlene plus 2 other members, Ted Burrows and Linda Cha. Ted Burrows was a semi-retired accountant who mostly went along with whatever Marlene said because she intimidated him slightly, and he didn't like conflict. Linda Cha was a much more reasonable person who I suspected was already quietly tired of Marlene's antics, but hadn't figured out how to push back effectively. What I didn't expect was what happened next. 4 days after I sent my response, in the middle of the coldest week of the winter so far, with temperatures at night dropping below zero and the roads a complete mess from continuous freeze-thaw cycles that had turned the entire neighborhood into a skating rink, I got a call from Linda Cha. Not an official HOA call, a personal call from her cell phone at about 8 in the evening. "Jason," she said, and she already sounded tired, "I wanted to give you a heads up. Marlene's escalating this." "Escalating how?" I said. I was sitting in my living room in front of the wood stove, which was putting out a gorgeous, steady heat. Biscuit was sprawled on the rug in front of it like he'd been professionally flattened there. It was genuinely cozy. "She's been calling the county environmental office," Linda said, "trying to get them to come out and cite you. She also contacted the HOA's attorney about the fine structure. She wants to start the daily fines immediately before the 30-day response period is even up." "She can't do that," I said. "The bylaws have a clear process. 30 days, then a hearing, then fines. Skipping any of that exposes the HOA to liability." "I know," Linda said. "I told her that. She's not listening." "What about Ted?" "Ted's going along with it," Linda said, with the weary tone of someone who had expected exactly that. "He told me Marlene convinced him you're creating a health hazard for the neighborhood." I sat with that for a moment, watching the fire through the stove's glass door, and then I said, "Linda, can I ask you something kind of funny?" "Sure," she said. "Has your living room been warm this winter?" A pause. "Unusually warm, actually." I turned my thermostat down 3 degrees because it kept getting too hot in the front room. "Why?" "Because your house is on the other side of mine from Marlene," I said. "You've been getting a little thermal bleed from my stove through our shared wall, same as Marlene has been getting on her side. You probably would have noticed your heating bills being slightly lower this winter than previous years." Another pause, longer this time. "Oh," Linda said slowly. "Yeah," I said. "Oh," she said again in a completely different tone, the tone of someone putting something together. "Marlene has been heating her living room with my wood stove for 3 winters," I said. "She just doesn't know it." Linda was quiet for about 5 seconds. Then she said, "I'll call you back," and hung up. The county environmental inspector came out 2 days later. I was actually relieved to see him because it meant this would get settled by someone with actual authority and actual expertise instead of by Marlene's clipboard. His name was Dale Hoffman. He was a friendly guy in his mid-50s, and he had clearly done this before. He arrived in a county truck, took some readings with an air quality meter near my chimney, looked at my stove documentation, inspected my firewood stack, and spent about 20 minutes total at my house. His findings were exactly what I already knew they would be. No violation. The smoke opacity was well within legal limits. The stove was properly installed, properly maintained, and EPA certified. The wood fuel was appropriate seasoned hardwood. He handed me a form confirming no violation was found, shook my hand, and left. I sent a copy of that form to the HOA via certified mail within the hour. I also emailed it to the full board, including Linda, with a brief note that given the county's findings, I trusted the HOA would be withdrawing the warning letter and confirming that no fines would be assessed. Marlene's response arrived the following Monday. Not an official HOA letter this time, but a handwritten note in my mailbox. The note said, in Marlene's very particular loopy handwriting, that the county inspection was insufficient, that she had consulted with a private environmental testing firm and was arranging for them to conduct their own assessment, and that in the meantime she was unilaterally issuing a fine of $200 per day effective immediately. Unilaterally, without a board vote, without a hearing, without completing the 30-day response period. Just Marlene Radcliffe with her clipboard and her pen deciding by herself that she was going to start fining me. I photographed the note. I read it twice. And then, for the first time since this whole thing started, I stopped being merely annoyed and started being genuinely interested. Because Marlene had just made a significant legal error. An HOA president acting unilaterally to impose fines, without board authorization, without following the required process established in the HOA's own governing documents, was not just a procedural problem. Depending on the specifics, it could constitute a breach of fiduciary duty. It could constitute fraudulent misrepresentation if she sent collection notices for fines that were never legally authorized. And if she followed through on the threat and actually tried to collect money based on her unauthorized note, we were potentially looking at actual legal violations. I called my attorney friend Marcus Delano that evening. Marcus is a real estate and HOA law specialist who I'd got to know through a mutual friend about a year and a half ago, right around the time Marlene had tried to use the HOA's lien authority to bully old Phil Kowalski into removing his gnomes. Marcus had helped Phil write a letter that made the HOA back down so fast it was almost comical. I'd stayed in touch with him ever since. "Tell me everything," Marcus said when I called him. I told him everything. The initial complaint, my response, the county inspection, the clean bill of health, and now Marlene's unilateral fine notice. Marcus was quiet for a moment, then said, "She sent you a handwritten note imposing a fine. Not a formal HOA letter, not following the process in the governing documents. Handwritten note in my mailbox," I confirmed. "No board vote, no hearing, the 30-day response period isn't even up yet. And you have the note, photographed and filed," I said. "Okay," Marcus said. "Here's what I want you to do. Do not pay that fine. Do not acknowledge it in any way that could be construed as accepting its legitimacy. Send a formal written notice to the full HOA board stating that you are disputing the fine on grounds that it was imposed without board authorization, without a hearing, and before the expiration of the required response period. Cite the relevant sections of the governing documents. Request written confirmation within 14 days that the fine has been voided, and CC me on everything. And if they don't void it," I asked. "Then we have a very interesting conversation with a judge," Marcus said. "But first let me ask you something. You said your stove is against the shared wall with Marlene's unit." "Right up against it," I said. "And it's been conducting heat into her unit for multiple winters." "Yes, I can prove it with my gas bill comparisons, my stove logs, and the thermal dynamics are just basic physics." Marcus made a considering sound. "That's actually really relevant," he said, "but not for the reason you might think. It's relevant to her motivation. If she's now suddenly objecting to something that's been benefiting her for 3 years, it raises questions about what actually prompted this. Did something change between you two recently? I thought about that, and then I remembered. About 6 weeks before Marlene showed up at my door with her clipboard that frozen morning, I had submitted a complaint to the HOA about Marlene's SUV being parked partially in the fire lane in front of our row of townhomes. I had done it because her parking had been blocking snow plow access, which meant our street wasn't getting fully cleared, which meant the ice buildup was getting dangerous for everyone. I had photographic evidence, I had submitted it properly, and the HOA had been required to send Marlene a warning notice. She'd moved the car, but she'd given me a look across the driveway that could have curdled milk. "Yeah," I told Marcus. 6 weeks ago, I complained about her parking in the fire lane during snowstorms. She had to move her car. "So this is retaliation," Marcus said. "Seems like it," I said. "That makes this even more interesting," Marcus said. "Keep documenting everything. And Jason, do not turn off that wood stove." "Wasn't planning to," I said. "It's supposed to be -8 degrees on Thursday." The next development came from a direction I hadn't expected. It came from the neighborhood itself. Pinecrest Commons had a neighborhood group chat, one of those big community text threads with about 60 households on it. It was mostly used for things like, "Has anyone seen a gray cat named Biscotti?" and "Heads up, the roads are bad on Elm Street this morning." But word travels fast in a small community, and apparently several of my neighbors had already heard about Marlene's campaign against my wood stove. I don't know exactly how. Maybe Linda said something. Maybe someone saw Marlene on my porch that first morning and asked around. Maybe the county inspector's truck in front of my house had sparked curiosity. Either way, on Wednesday evening, while I was sitting with a mug of cider, watching the snow fall outside my window for what felt like the 15th time that winter, my phone started buzzing with messages in the neighborhood group chat. It started with Phil Kowalski, bless him. Phil, 71 years old, retired high school history teacher, guardian of 16-inch garden gnomes, typed in all caps. "I heard Marlene is trying to find Jason for his WOODSTOVE. That is absurd and I am against it." Then a woman named Rosa Pemberton 3 doors down wrote, "Jason, we love your wood stove. Our kids walk past your house every morning going to the bus stop, and they always say it smells like Christmas. That's not a nuisance, that's a neighborhood treasure." Then Derek Huang from the far end of the street, "Is it true she's fining people without a board vote? Because that sounds illegal. My brother-in-law is an HOA attorney and he says that's definitely not allowed." Then about 12 other people chiming in with variations on the same theme, ranging from supportive to outright angry. And then, buried in the middle of the thread, a message from a woman named Connie Walsh who lived in the townhouse unit directly across the street from Marlene. "Side note, has anyone else noticed that Marlene's living room blinds are always open and it always looks warm and cozy over there? Almost like she's getting free heat from somewhere. Ha ha." I read Connie's message twice and actually laughed out loud, which startled Biscuit off the couch. I didn't respond to the group chat directly that night. I didn't want to turn it into a public airing of grievances. But I did reach out privately to Derek Huang and mention that yes, there were some procedural concerns with how the HOA had handled things, and I was consulting with an attorney about it. Derek said his brother-in-law was happy to talk if I needed a second opinion. The next day, Thursday, it hit -8 degrees as forecast. The kind of cold that makes your nose hairs freeze the second you step outside, where you can hear the house itself creaking and settling in protest, where the snow on the ground squeaks under your boots like styrofoam. My truck didn't want to start on the first try. The roads were a sheet of ice under a thin dusting of overnight snow, and 3 people on the neighborhood chat reported sliding incidents on the main road into the development. School was 2 hours delayed. My wood stove was running beautifully. I had loaded it up the night before with a good bed of oak coals and a couple of big pieces of cherry, and by morning the living room was a solid 72 degrees without my gas furnace running at all. Biscuit had migrated from the couch to the rug in front of the stove and was sprawled there with the boneless commitment of a dog who has found his personal paradise. At around 10 in the morning, I got a text from Linda Cha. It said, "Marlene's heat went out." I stared at my phone. Then I texted back. "What?" Linda replied. "Her gas furnace. It stopped working last night. She called the emergency repair line, but with this cold snap they're backed up until tomorrow at the earliest. She's currently calling the propane company about a space heater. I only know this because she called me this morning to complain that the HOA should have a procedure for heating emergencies." I sat with this for a full minute. Marlene's gas furnace had stopped working on the coldest night of the year, and the only thing keeping her living room from becoming a walk-in freezer right now was my wood stove, radiating heat through our shared brick wall, the same wood stove she had issued an unauthorized fine notice to try to shut down. I did not text back anything snarky to Linda. I'm somewhat proud of myself for that. What I did do was add more wood to the stove, because, regardless of everything, I was not going to let the wall go cold and have Marlene freeze. Whatever her garbage was, this wasn't the moment to play games with someone's basic safety in -8-degree weather. But I did start building my documentation more carefully. I had a temperature logger. One of those little Bluetooth devices I'd originally set up to monitor the temperature in my garage during cold snaps to make sure my water pipes didn't freeze. I had 2 of them. I moved one to the room directly adjacent to the shared wall on my side, set it to log every 15 minutes, and let it run. I also pulled out my thermal camera, which I'd bought a couple years back for diagnosing heat loss around windows and doors, and took a series of images of the shared wall from my side. The infrared images were striking. The entire shared wall glowed warm orange and yellow in the thermal view, radiating heat in both directions, into my living room and into Marlene's. I saved everything. Meanwhile, the repair service finally got to Marlene the following afternoon. Her furnace had a cracked heat exchanger, which is actually a serious problem because a cracked heat exchanger can leak carbon monoxide. The repair tech condemned the unit on the spot and tagged it out of service. It couldn't be fixed with a patch job. She needed a new furnace. In January, when every HVAC contractor in the county was backed up 3 weeks because of the cold snap. I heard all of this through Linda, who was now essentially serving as a back-channel communication link between Marlene's situation and my awareness of it, mostly because Linda was genuinely worried about the situation and didn't think Marlene should be suffering in the cold, even if Marlene was also currently being unreasonable about the wood stove. "How cold is her house right now?" I asked Linda during one of these calls. "She said 58 degrees this morning," Linda said. "She's got one electric space heater running, but it's not keeping up. She's wrapped up in blankets on her couch. 58 degrees. And the wall between our units, according to my temperature logger, was sitting at a consistent 63 degrees on my side because of the stove, which meant it was probably putting a solid 5 to 8 degrees of heat into Marlene's side, which meant without my stove, she'd be sitting at around 50 or 51 degrees, which in -8-degree weather was genuinely miserable and potentially dangerous for someone sleeping. I thought about this for about an hour. Then I put on my coat, walked around to Marlene's front door and knocked. She answered after a minute, wrapped in a fleece blanket and looking uncharacteristically small. Her usual clipboard energy was entirely absent. She looked cold and tired, and for just a moment before she registered that it was me, genuinely relieved to hear a knock at her door. When she saw me, the relief curdled into something more guarded. "Jason," she said. "Marlene," I said. "I heard about your furnace. I wanted to let you know that my wood stove has been running on high since yesterday, and your side of the shared wall is benefiting from the heat transfer. But I also wanted to let you know that if you wanted to set up a temporary space heater in your living room close to the shared wall, it would be more effective than running it in the middle of the room, because the wall's already warm." She stared at me. Whatever she'd expected me to say, it clearly wasn't that. "I also have an extra set of thermal curtains I never installed," I added. "They'd help keep the heat in your rooms overnight. You're welcome to borrow them." She kept staring. Then, in a voice that sounded like it cost her considerable effort, she said, "Why are you doing this?" "Because it's -8 degrees and your furnace is broken," I said. "That's a dangerous situation. The wood stove disagreement can wait until it's not dangerous." A very long pause, then, "I'll take the thermal curtains." I went back inside, got the curtains, and brought them over. We didn't say much. I showed her how to hang them. She thanked me stiffly, in the tone of someone who has never thanked anyone for anything in her life, and is finding the experience deeply uncomfortable. I went back home. I did not feel magnanimous or noble about it. I felt like a regular person doing the obvious thing when a neighbor, even a difficult one, needed help. But I also continued building my case. Because niceness in an emergency doesn't mean the wrongful fine notice goes away. Marcus sent the formal dispute letter to the HOA board by certified mail the following Monday. It was thorough, precise, and exceptionally clear. It documented the timeline of events. It cited the specific bylaw provisions that required a board vote, a proper notice period, and a hearing before any fines could be assessed. It noted that no board vote had been taken, that the response period had not expired, and that the county environmental inspection had found no violation. It cited Marlene's handwritten unilateral fine notice as evidence of an unauthorized act taken in her capacity as HOA president, without board authorization. It noted that the timing of the fine notice, occurring approximately 6 weeks after Marlene received an HOA warning about her own parking violation, suggested retaliatory motivation. And it formally demanded that the HOA board vote to officially void the fine notice and provide written confirmation of that vote within 10 business days, or face legal action for breach of fiduciary duty and potential fraudulent assessment of unauthorized fees. The letter also contained one additional section that I'd specifically asked Marcus to include. It described, in precise and documented detail, the thermal dynamics of the shared wall between my unit and Marlene's unit, and noted that my wood stove had been providing passive supplemental heat to Marlene's residence for a period of approximately 3 winters. It cited my gas bill data, my temperature logs, and the thermal camera images. It noted that Marlene's recent heating crisis, in which her gas furnace failed during the coldest week of the year, had demonstrated in real time the degree to which she depended on heat transfer from my stove through the shared wall, given that her unit had remained above 55 degrees despite the failure of her primary heating system. The purpose of including this information, Marcus explained to me, was threefold. First, it established a record that my wood stove had a direct and documented positive impact on Marlene's living conditions, directly undermining her claim that it was a nuisance. Second, it was relevant to any future calculation of unjust enrichment if the HOA or Marlene attempted to claim the stove was purely a burden on the community. Third, it was, frankly, the kind of information that tends to make people realize they have been cutting off their nose to spite their face, and sometimes that realization is useful. Linda Cha told me later that when the letter arrived and she read it at the board meeting, Ted Burrows went pale and asked to adjourn so he could call his personal attorney. Marlene, according to Linda, sat very still and very quiet, which was apparently so unusual that it alarmed Ted more than the letter itself had. The board voted 4 days later. Linda voted in favor of voiding the fine notice. Ted voted in favor of voiding it. Marlene abstained, which under the HOA's governing documents counted as a non-opposing vote and meant the motion passed unanimously. The HOA sent me a formal letter, via certified mail, confirming that the warning letter and the unilateral fine notice were both officially voided, that no fines had been assessed or would be assessed in connection with this matter, and that the HOA had found no basis for proceeding with any further action regarding my wood stove. I framed it. I'm not even joking. I printed it out and put it in a frame and hung it in my home office. It's the most satisfying piece of paper I own. But the story doesn't end there because Marlene wasn't quite done, and the winter wasn't quite done with us either. About a week after the fine notice was voided, I started getting odd things. A noise complaint notice, official HOA letterhead, claiming that my firewood splitting activities were creating undue noise disturbance during quiet hours. I split firewood in my backyard occasionally on weekend afternoons. My backyard camera had footage of every splitting session from the past 4 months. The most recent one had been a Saturday at 2 in the afternoon, well within the permitted hours, for about 45 minutes. I responded to the noise complaint with the video timestamps, the relevant bylaw language on permitted quiet hours, and a note that my activities were fully within the rules. Then a week after that, A letter claiming my firewood stack violated HOA aesthetic guidelines because it was visible from the street. My firewood stack was in my backyard, behind my fence. I sent photos showing this. Letter withdrawn. Then a claim that my chimney, due to its age and the visible smoke, might not be compliant with the HOA's architectural standards for exterior property maintenance. I sent the October inspection certificate again, plus a new one I'd scheduled because honestly at this point it was just easier to stay 3 steps ahead. Each time I responded promptly with documentation and sent copies to Marcus. And each time Marcus sent a follow-up note to the full board reminding them that a pattern of repeated unsubstantiated complaints directed at a single resident, occurring in close succession following a formal legal dispute, could constitute harassment and could expose the HOA and individual board members to personal liability. After the third exchange, Ted Burrows called me directly. "Jason," he said, sounding exhausted, "can we just talk for a minute?" "Sure, Ted," I said. "This has to stop," he said. "I know I haven't been great in all of this. I should have pushed back sooner. But these repeated notices, they're coming from Marlene and she's not running them by me before she sends them. I'm finding out about them the same time you are." "That's a problem for the board," I said. "If she's sending official HOA correspondence without board authorization, that's the same issue we had with the fine notice. She can't act unilaterally." "I know," Ted said. "I'm going to propose a new rule at the next board meeting. Requires board majority approval before any notice or fine is issued to a resident. No more one-person decisions." "I'd support that," I said. "And Ted, if you want a resident to come and address the board about what's happened over the past couple months, I'm happy to do that." "That would actually be really helpful," Ted said. The board meeting was held on a Thursday evening in late February in the community room of the main HOA building, which was a small, slightly depressing room with folding chairs and a whiteboard. About 30 residents showed up, which was reportedly 3 times the normal attendance. The word had gotten around, helped along considerably by Phil Kowalski, who had put a printed flyer in everyone's mailbox, because Phil was 71 and still believed in the power of physical media. I sat in the front row with Marcus beside me. Biscuit was at home, probably asleep in front of the stove. Marlene arrived in her usual coat with the fur-lined hood, clipboard in hand, and took her place at the board table. She looked out at the much larger than expected crowd and something flickered across her face. It might have been surprise. It might have been calculation. Hard to tell with Marlene. Ted opened the meeting, ran through the standard items quickly, and then got to the main agenda item. A review of HOA governance procedures and a proposed amendment to require board majority approval for all resident notices and fines. Before the discussion started, I asked to address the board. Ted recognized me. I stood up and gave a calm, organized, 8-minute summary of everything that had happened since December. The initial complaint, my documented response, the county inspection and its findings, the unauthorized unilateral fine notice, the legal dispute and its resolution, the subsequent pattern of additional notices, the thermal wall situation. I kept it factual and unemotional. I had a printed packet of key documents for anyone who wanted one, and Phil had already distributed most of them before the meeting started. When I finished, I said, "I'm not asking the board to take sides. I'm asking the board to do what it should have been doing all along, which is require proper process, require proper authorization, and make sure no single board member can make decisions that affect residents' lives and finances without oversight. This proposed amendment would prevent what happened to me from happening to anyone else." A number of people in the folding chairs started clapping, which was slightly more dramatic than I'd anticipated, but I can't say I minded. Marlene asked to speak. She said the HOA president needed the authority to act quickly in cases of community standards violations, and that requiring a board vote for every notice would create administrative delays. It was a reasonable-sounding argument, delivered in her best authoritative voice, and it might have been more persuasive if the audience hadn't just spent 8 minutes hearing what happened when that authority went unchecked. Rosa Pemberton raised her hand and said, "The chimney smoke smells like Christmas. I don't think this was ever actually about community standards." Phil Kowalski, from the back of the room, bellowed, "The gnomes were 16 inches." Which was only tangentially relevant but captured the room's energy perfectly. Derek Huang calmly and precisely said, "The proposed amendment is standard practice for HOA governance in this state. Most well-run HOAs already operate this way. The current lack of oversight is actually the anomaly." The vote on the amendment was 28 in favor, 1 abstained, and Marlene voted against. It passed. Then Ted proposed a second item, which he had not shared with Marlene in advance. A resolution to censure the HOA president for the unauthorized issuance of a fine notice in December, in violation of the HOA's governing documents. The censure would be a formal reprimand entered into the HOA's official records, and it would require Marlene to complete a governance training course approved by the state HOA regulatory body before exercising any further enforcement powers. Marlene turned and stared at Ted with an expression I can only describe as betrayed. Ted looked uncomfortable but held firm. Linda voted for censure. Ted voted for censure. Marlene voted against. The censure passed. Marlene stood up from the board table, collected her clipboard, said, "This is completely inappropriate," in a very clipped voice, and walked out of the meeting. The door closed behind her. There was a moment of silence. Then Rosa Pemberton said, "Well, that's a first." The room actually laughed. Not meanly, exactly. Just the laughter of a group of people who have been carrying a collective tension for a long time and finally felt it lift. Over the next few weeks, things in Pinecrest Commons shifted noticeably. The new approval process for notices and fines went into effect. The first time a resident received a notice under the new process, it had been reviewed by all 3 board members before it was sent. The violation was real and clearly documented. And the resident, a guy named Frank who had let his gutters overflow all fall and whose ice dams were genuinely a problem, agreed to fix it immediately. That was exactly how it was supposed to work. Marlene came back to the next board meeting, to her credit, and participated without her clipboard energy, which was actually a meaningful improvement. She was quieter. She voted on things. She stopped sending solo notices. Whether this was genuine reform or just strategic patience, I honestly couldn't tell. But the behavior had changed, and that was what mattered for the rest of us. Her furnace replacement finally got done in mid-February. A brand new high-efficiency gas unit that a contractor fit in during a brief warm spell when the roads were finally dry enough for the delivery truck to make it through. She knocked on my door the day after it was installed. I opened the door. She was holding a small tin, the kind that has butter cookies in it around the holidays. She held it out. "The thermal curtains helped," she said. "And your stove, I know that now. I didn't know before." I took the tin. "I know you didn't," I said, and I meant it. She genuinely hadn't known. She'd complained about something she didn't understand, and when she'd been educated about what it actually was, she'd had the worst possible introduction to that education, which was a broken furnace at -8 degrees. But she was standing here with butter cookies instead of a clipboard. "Thank you for bringing them over anyway," she added, meaning the thermal curtains. "Any time," I said. She nodded once sharply and went back to her house. It wasn't a full redemption arc. It wasn't a warm hug and tears, but it was something. In the context of Marlene Radcliffe, a tin of butter cookies was practically a peace treaty. By the time March rolled in and the worst of the winter started loosening its grip on Pinecrest Commons, things were genuinely different. Not perfect, but different in the ways that mattered. The HOA had better oversight procedures. Residents felt more confident about pushing back on unreasonable enforcement. The neighborhood chat had evolved from just lost cat alerts into an actual community communication tool where people shared information, supported each other during the snow emergencies, organized a volunteer shoveling crew for the elderly residents who couldn't manage their driveways safely, and generally acted like neighbors rather than HOA subjects. Phil Kowalski, inspired by the whole saga, ran for the open resident seat on the HOA advisory committee and won by a comfortable margin. His first proposal was a formal written guide for residents explaining their rights under the HOA's governing documents in plain language, no legal jargon, just clear explanations of what the HOA could and couldn't do. Ted Burrows helped him draft it. Linda Cha edited it. It went out to every household in Pinecrest Commons in a bright yellow folder. Marcus reviewed the HOA's governing documents as part of a broader review he offered to do at the board's request, pro bono, because he said the situation had been interesting enough to be worth his time, and identified 3 additional provisions that were either outdated or potentially unenforceable under current state law. The board agreed to a formal bylaw revision process, which was scheduled for the spring, with resident input sessions open to the whole community. I kept the Woodstove running through the end of March, because the nights were still cold, and because it was simply the best way to heat my house, and I'd done nothing wrong by using it. My gas bills for the winter were notably lower than they'd been the previous year. My logs of stove operation, temperatures, and wood consumption were meticulous and filed neatly in a folder in my home office next to the framed copy of the fine voiding letter. On the last really cold night of the winter, a Saturday in late March when a final cold front pushed temperatures back down into the low 20s and the forecast called for one last dusting of snow, I loaded the stove up with a good bed of coals and a couple of big oak pieces and let it run through the night. Biscuit was on the rug. I had a mug of cider. The snow came down outside in a quiet, gentle way, covering the neighborhood in a last thin layer of white that would be gone by Tuesday. I thought about what the winter had been. The ridiculous complaint, the clipboard energy, and the 7:30 in the morning ambush. The unauthorized fine notice, and the legal letters, and the board meeting, and the butter cookies. The neighborhood getting activated, and Phil Kowalski's flyers, and Rosa Pemberton saying it smelled like Christmas. Ted Burrows finally finding his spine. Linda Cha being the quiet, reasonable voice that kept things from going completely off the rails. The county inspector's clean finding, the thermal camera images glowing warm orange on the shared wall, and Marlene, wrapped in a fleece blanket in a 58-degree living room, unknowingly heated by the same stove she was trying to shut down. There's something almost poetic about that if you squint at it right. The thing she was fighting against was the thing keeping her warm. She just hadn't known it. And once she knew it, once the evidence was unavoidable and her own furnace had made the lesson impossible to ignore, the fight had kind of gone out of her, not completely. Marlene would never not have a little clipboard energy somewhere inside her, but enough. I didn't gloat. It wasn't worth it, and it wasn't really the point. The point was that the rules got fixed, the community got stronger, the oversight got better, and my Woodstove kept burning legally, within code, within the bylaws, within the county regulations, just as it always had. I stoked the fire one more time before bed, watched the coals settle and glow, and went upstairs to sleep while the last snowstorm of the winter dusted the neighborhood outside my window, and the heat moved slowly, steadily, through the brick wall on its way to wherever it was needed. Spring came about 10 days later. It came all at once the way it does in these parts, where the snow is still on the ground one morning, and by the following weekend it's 48 degrees, and everyone is out on their driveways like they've been released from prison, blinking in the pale sunlight and remarking on how nice it is. My Woodstove went into its off-season mode, damped down to barely ticking over, and by the first week of April it was cold and dormant until next fall. The HOA spring newsletter, the first one issued under the new board procedures and co-written by Phil and Linda with input from Ted, had a whole section on how the new resident rights guide worked and when residents could and couldn't receive fines. It also had a brief note about the firewood safety program that Rosa Pemberton had proposed, which was a neighborly initiative where residents with excess seasoned firewood could post a notice in the community, and others who needed it could arrange to purchase or trade for it, keeping the neighborhood more self-sufficient during winter emergencies. Marlene contributed a brief paragraph to the newsletter about the HOA's heating assistance protocols for residents experiencing emergency furnace failures in winter. It was practical, it was useful, and it was clearly written from experience. She did not mention wood stoves. She did not mention shared walls. But I'd like to think she was aware of both when she wrote it. I ran into her at the community mailboxes about a week after the newsletter went out. She was picking up her mail, I was picking up mine. We both acknowledged each other with a nod, the neutral, functional nod of two people who have been through something and found a way to exist on the same street afterward. "Nice weather," I said. "Finally," she said. And that was it. That was enough. We got our mail and went back to our separate houses through the same shared world. The firewood stack in my backyard was down to about a third of what I'd started the winter with, which was about right. I'd already started looking at splitting a new batch in May, letting it season through the summer, and having it ready for next fall. I had a standing order with a local timber guy named Carl who sold me mixed hardwood every year, good clean oak and cherry and apple, the kind that burns hot and long and puts out the kind of steady, reliable heat that a cast-iron wood stove was designed to use. I'd also, just because I could, scheduled a new chimney inspection for September. Fully certified, fully documented, certificate filed in the folder in my home office next to everything else. Because if this winter had taught me anything, it was that preparation and documentation aren't paranoia. They're just good sense, especially when you live in a semi-detached townhome with a shared wall and an HOA board that's had some governance issues. Biscuit discovered the backyard again as the snow melted away, and he spent the first week of April doing very intensive reconnaissance of every corner of the yard to assess what had happened under the snow for the past 3 months. His findings seemed to be largely satisfactory, based on the amount of tail wagging involved. The HOA bylaw revision process kicked off in April with a first resident input session held on a Saturday morning in the community room. About 20 people came. Phil Kowalski facilitated with an enthusiasm that was borderline theatrical, but also completely effective. Marcus Delano attended as a volunteer legal advisor. Ted Burrows took detailed notes. Linda Cha organized the coffee and kept the conversation on track. Marlene attended, sat in the back, and made 3 specific, concrete, constructive suggestions about the complaint procedure that were actually quite good and ended up being incorporated into the revised bylaws. Whatever you could say about Marlene at her worst, she was not without genuine knowledge of how these systems were supposed to work. She'd just been using that knowledge in the service of her own agenda for too long. Applied in the right direction, it was actually an asset. It wasn't the story arc anyone would have written for her going in, but it was the one that happened which made it better. By midsummer, Pinecrest Commons was, by most observable measures, a meaningfully better community than it had been the previous December. Not because one person had been heroically defeated by another person, but because a series of small, documented, deliberate choices had forced a broken system to fix itself. The oversight was better, the transparency was better, the communication was better. And people knew their rights now, which meant they were more confident, which meant the balance of power between the HOA and its residents was more appropriately calibrated. Phil kept his gnomes. They were 17 inches, actually, as measured by a city engineer he'd convinced to come out and settle the question once and for all. But since 18 inches was the limit, it was fine either way. Rosa Pemberton organized the 4th of July block party, which was the best one in 6 years according to the general consensus of everyone who attended. Derek Huang brought a spectacular amount of food. Connie Walsh won the cornhole tournament. Old Phil Kowalski gave a speech that was simultaneously about the Declaration of Independence and about HOA governance that was somehow both relevant and surprisingly moving. I brought Biscuit, who was extremely popular with everyone, and I stood in my driveway in the warm July evening and watched my neighbors being neighbors. And I thought about a cold December morning when a woman with a clipboard had looked up at a thin curl of white smoke and decided it was a problem to be solved. She hadn't known what it was. She hadn't known what she was seeing. She'd seen the symptom without understanding the system, and she'd made the kind of mistake that happens when authority goes unchecked and curiosity goes undeveloped. The smoke was the heat. The heat was the wall. The wall was shared. That was always the whole story, right there in the physics of it. We were sharing a wall whether we wanted to or not. The only question was what we were going to do with that fact. The Woodstove would be running again come October. I'd already had the flue cleaned, the baffle inspected, the door gasket replaced as a precaution, and the whole installation reviewed by my certified chimney sweep, who signed a certificate that was already in the folder. My firewood stack was beautiful, 6 cords of mixed hardwood stacked and split and drying in the summer heat, smelling of fresh cut oak and cherry. Next winter would be cold, because it always was. The roads would ice over and the snow would pile up and the furnaces would work hard, and some of them would inevitably fail because that's what happens in the middle of January when it decides to drop below zero for a week. And my wood stove would run. It would put out its clean, steady heat, and that heat would move through the brick wall the way it always had, warming both sides of a shared life that neither of us had chosen but both of us were living. That seemed right to me. That seemed like enough. And somewhere across our shared wall, I like to think, Marlene Radcliffe was sitting in her newly warm living room with her perfectly functioning new furnace and her butter cookie tin on the shelf. And on the coldest nights, without her clipboard and without her guard entirely up, maybe she let herself appreciate the extra warmth that came through the bricks from next door. Not because she had to admit anything. Not because anyone was keeping score. Just because warmth, regardless of its source, is warmth. And in the deep cold of winter, you take it where you find it, even if it comes from the neighbor you spent December trying to shut down, especially then.